You've seen the swords, the axes, the shields, but Hollywood left out the weapons that actually terrified medieval Europe. Spears that punched through armor, hooks that yanked warriors overboard, and tools that turned ships into floating death traps. Some were so effective, laws tried to ban them. Here are 10 forgotten Viking weapons that movies never show. Picture Gunnar of Hlíðarendi, one of Iceland's most legendary warriors, standing alone against his enemies. In his hands, not a sword, not an axe, an atgeir, a weapon so rare and mysterious that even Vikings struggled to describe it. The atgeir wasn't a normal spear. Sagas call it a hewing spear or mail piercer, suggesting a weapon designed to punch through the iron rings that stopped most blades. Some historians think it resembled a glaive, a single-edged blade on a long shaft, meant for chopping downward like an axe, but with the reach of a spear. Others argue it was a heavy-thrusting weapon, reinforced at the tip, built specifically to crack open armor joints. What we know for certain, it was a prestige weapon. Only named warriors and sagas carry them. Gunnar's atgeir was so famous, it had a reputation of its own, and when he finally died, it was because enemies caught him without it. The weapon was that central to his legend. One saga describes an atgeir strike splitting a helmet and the skull beneath in a single blow. Another tells of a thrust that went through a shield, through mail, and into the chest behind. The genius of the atgeir was its hybrid nature. Too heavy to throw, too long to use in a tight press, but in open ground, it gave you the cutting power of an axe combined with spear reach. But here's the mystery. Archaeologists have yet to conclusively identify one in the ground. Either they weren't buried with their owners, or the term described a function rather than a single design. Some weapons fit the description, long-bladed spears with reinforced sockets, but the puzzle remains unsolved. Still, one thing's certain. If a Viking was carrying an atgeir, you didn't want to be in his path. And while the atgeir was built to pierce armor, the next weapon didn't need to get close. It could shatter skulls from half a football field away. Forget the hand sling David used against Goliath. This was something far more devastating. A staff sling was a short wooden pole about 1 meter long with a leather pouch attached to one end. Load it with a rock the size of your fist, swing it overhead like a trebuchet in miniature, and release. That stone could fly over 150 meters at speeds that would crack helmets, shatter collarbones, or drop a man stone-cold unconscious. The King's Mirror, a Norwegian text from around 1250, specifically lists staff slings among essential shipboard weapons, not just bows or spears, but staff slings. Why? Because on a rocking deck, accuracy mattered less than raw stopping power. A volley of fist-sized stones raining down on an enemy ship didn't need to be precise. It just needed to break things. Helms, shields, oars, bones, anything in the way. Archaeological experiments have proven their terrifying effectiveness. Modern tests show a staff sling delivers 3 times the force of a hand sling, and with training, a warrior could fire one every 10 seconds. Imagine 10 men on a longship, each hurling stones in rotation. That's 6 impacts per minute, hammering your deck before a single blade is drawn. But there were risks. A wet leather pouch, soaked from sea spray, could slip at the wrong moment, sending your rock sideways into your own crew. And if you mistime the release, the stone tumbles backward over your head, and now you're the one on the ground. Unlike bows, which needed dry strings and rare yew wood, staff slings were cheap. A stick, some leather, and rocks from any beach. Peasant simple, but warrior effective. And while stones crushed from a distance, the next weapon lived in the brutal closeness of ship-to-ship combat. The Viking longship slams alongside yours, shields lock, warriors scream, and then someone hooks you by the neck and drags you into the sea. Boat hooks weren't designed as weapons, they were tools. Long wooden poles tipped with iron hooks, used to pull ships to shore, snag drifting cargo, or push away from docks. But in the chaos of a sea battle, they became instruments of absolute terror. Imagine this. You're fighting on a narrow deck, maybe 2 meters wide, with freezing water on both sides. A Viking lunges, not with a sword, but with a 2-meter pole ending in a curved iron hook. He doesn't stab, he snags. The hook catches your shield rim and rips it from your grip. Or worse, it catches your neck, your belt, your arm, and suddenly you're being dragged overboard. No time to drop your weapons, no time to grab hold, just cold water and drowning. Chronicles from the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000 describe exactly this tactic. Warriors using hooks to pull enemies off their feet or drag them between ships where they'd be crushed by the hulls. One moment you're standing, the next you're gone. No glory, no saga, just a name forgotten in the waves. The hook's genius was its reach and leverage. You didn't need strength to kill, you needed timing. A quick yank could topple even an armored man, and on a rocking ship, balance was everything. Miss with a sword and you're open to counterattack. Miss with a hook and you just pull again. But there was a dark side. That same hook could catch on rigging, tangle in your own ship's lines, or, if your opponent was fast, get grabbed and used to pull you forward into a spear thrust. And unlike a spear, a boat hook had no point for thrusting, no edge for cutting. If you lost the element of surprise, you were holding a long, awkward stick. Still, in the right hands, on the right deck, a boat hook was a nightmare made iron. And while hooks yanked men into the sea, the next weapon turned Vikings into repeating artillery. The Francisca was a throwing axe, originally Frankish but adopted by Vikings through trade and raiding. These weren't your standard battle axes. They were compact, cutting edges around 10 centimeters, weighing only 600 grams, light enough to hurl one-handed but heavy enough to punch through shields. The head had a distinctive S-curve designed to spin aerodynamically when thrown and bite deep on impact. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia confirm Vikings used throwing axes, likely acquired from Frankish territories or copied by Norse blacksmiths. The genius of the Francisca was its unpredictability. Unlike an arrow that flies straight, a spinning axe bounces, tumbles, deflects at odd angles. Even if it missed the warrior, it could catch a shield, hook an edge, yank it aside, leaving the defender wide open. Vikings used them to soften enemy lines before closing distance. Imagine standing in a shield wall when a dozen Franciscas come spinning in. You raise your shield. Crack. The axe blade bites into the wood, the weight yanks your arm down, and suddenly there's a spear coming at your exposed chest. That split-second disruption was the point, but throwing axes had risks. Hurl one badly and it spins wrong, glances off harmlessly. Or worse, bounces back toward your own line. Throw too early and you're weaponless when the real fight starts. That's why Vikings carried them as openers, not main weapons. Disrupt, disarm, then draw your real steel. And while Francisca spun through the air, the next weapon hooked enemies in close combat with brutal efficiency. You thrust your spear into an enemy's chest. He screams, staggers backward, and your spear is stuck. The blade won't pull free. In the chaos of battle, you're now weaponless, staring at 3 more warriors rushing towards you. That's the nightmare the Krukspjot was designed to inflict, but in reverse. The Krukspjot, or hooked spear, had wings or barbs jutting from the base of the blade. These weren't decorative, they were tactical. When the blade entered flesh or caught on a shield, those barbs locked in place, making the weapon nearly impossible to remove. But for the wielder, the wings gave you options. You could hook an enemy's shield and yank it down, catch a spear shaft and snap it sideways, even trip a charging warrior by hooking his ankle or belt. Sagas specifically mention Krokspjot being used to devastating effect. The Gulathing Law, a 13th century Norwegian legal code, even listed being wounded by a barbed spear as a form of dishonorable manslaying because the barbs had to be cut out of the victim. Imagine that, a weapon so brutal it was legally condemned. Archaeological finds from Birka in Sweden and across Scandinavia show spearheads with clear wings and barbs, some resembling earlier Germanic Angon spears. These weren't throwing spears, they were close combat nightmares, designed to control the battlefield by controlling your opponent's gear and movement. But the Krukspjot had a weakness. Those same barbs that hooked enemies could catch on your own shield, your clothing, or the battlefield debris at your feet. And if you thrust poorly and the barbs caught on bone instead of sliding between ribs, you were stuck holding a weapon you couldn't retrieve, leaving you open to counterattack. Still, in the hands of a skilled warrior, the Krukspjot turned defense into offense, trapping enemies in a fight they couldn't escape. And while barbed spears trapped warriors on land, the next weapon trapped entire ships on the sea. Forget Greek fire. Vikings had something simpler, cheaper, and just as terrifying. Clay pots filled with resin, pitch, and sulfur lit and hurled onto enemy decks. The King's Mirror lists coal and sulfur as among the best weapons for sea battles. Not swords, not arrows, but fire. Why? Because on a wooden ship coated in tar and rigging soaked in oil, fire doesn't just kill, it spreads. One cracked pot on a dry deck, and within minutes the whole vessel is ablaze. Sails catch, tar-caulked seams ignite. Warriors can't fight and put out flames at the same time, so they jump, and drowning men can't swing swords. Archaeological finds from Scandinavian coastal sites have uncovered charred clay fragments with residue matching pine resin and sulfur compounds. These weren't cooking pots, they were ammunition. The mixture was brutal in its simplicity. Tree pitch for sticky flames, sulfur to burn hot and fast, sometimes mixed with animal fat or oil. Seal it in clay, light a rag wick, and hurl it before it explodes in your hand. The tactic was devastating during boarding actions. As ships closed, the first volley wasn't steel. It was fire. Flames forced defenders to scatter, breaking their shield wall before the first Viking even stepped aboard. And once a fire started, even throwing the pot overboard didn't help. Burning pitch floats, turning the sea itself into a weapon. But fire pots were a gamble. A cracked pot before you threw it. and now you're the one engulfed in flames. A pot that landed badly could roll back towards your own crew. Wind could blow fire onto your own sails. One saga mentions a raid where a fire pot shattered mid-throw, covering 3 men in burning resin. They jumped into the sea, still burning. Still, the psychological impact was unmatched. You could train warriors to face axes and arrows, but fire turned men into animals, scrambling and screaming. And Vikings knew that terror was a weapon too. And while fire consumed ships, the next weapon came in 3 deadly forms, each more vicious than the last. You've heard of the seax, the Viking utility knife, but there were versions of it that weren't tools at all. They were assassin's blades. The broken back seax had a spine that angled sharply downward near the tip, creating a wicked drooping point. That shape wasn't decorative, it concentrated force into a narrow stabbing edge, perfect for punching through gaps in mail or sliding between ribs. One thrust and the blade went deep, the angled tip guiding itself into flesh. Archaeologists have found broken-back sea axes in warrior graves across England and Denmark, some with edges worn smooth from repeated sharpening, proof they saw heavy, brutal use. The long sea axe was different, a single-edged blade stretching 50 to 70 centimeters, almost as long as a short sword, but with no crossguard. In close quarters grappling, where swords were too long and axes too slow, the long sea axe was king. You could draw it faster, thrust it quicker, and because it had only one edge, you knew instinctively which side cut. Sagas describe warriors carrying long sexes horizontally behind their backs, hidden until the moment they needed to gut someone at arm's length. Then there was the narrow thrusting seax, a stiletto-like variant with a blade barely 2 fingers wide. It wasn't for cutting, it was for killing. The narrow profile slipped between mail rings, through leather gaps, into eye slits of helmets. One grave in Norway contained a thrusting seax alongside a broken spearhead and a crushed skull, telling a violent story without words. What made seax variants terrifying was their secrecy. A sword announced you were armed. A seax, hidden under a cloak tucked in a belt drawn in a heartbeat. Many assassinations and sagas involved seaxes, not swords, because you could carry one into a feast, into a home, into a moment of trust. But every variant had the same fatal weakness. No crossguard meant your hand could slide forward onto your own blade during a hard thrust. More than a few Vikings learned that lesson the hard way, bleeding out from their own carelessness. Still, in a shield wall that had collapsed into a knife fight brawl, a good seax meant survival. And survival meant you lived to fight another day. And while seaxes killed in secret, the next weapon trapped ships in the open by dragging them into hell. The Vikings didn't just raid, they trapped their enemies on the water. Grappling hooks were brutal simplicity. 3 or 4 iron prongs welded together, attached to a length of thick rope. Throw it across to an enemy ship, let the hooks bite into the rail or rigging, and then pull. Suddenly, that ship trying to flee, it's not going anywhere. You've lashed it to your fate. The genius of grappling hooks was psychological. On land, you could retreat. At sea, once hooked, you were committed. The enemy couldn't row away, couldn't maneuver, couldn't do anything but fight or burn. Chronicles from the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000 describe longships chained together by grappling irons, creating a massive floating battlefield where warriors leapt from deck to deck. The ships that tried to escape found themselves dragged back by their own rigging. But grappling hooks weren't just for ships. In boarding actions, warriors used smaller versions to hook onto shield rims, yank weapons from hands, or snag enemies by their clothing and drag them into the chaos. One account mentions a raider using a boarding iron to pull a defender face first into a shield boss, breaking his nose and stunning him long enough for a killing blow. The risk? Once you threw a hook, you were tethered. If your ship started sinking and the hook held fast, you dragged the enemy down with you, or they dragged you. And if your enemy was clever, they could cut the rope, leaving you holding a useless iron claw while they sailed away. Worse, in the press of battle, grappling ropes became trip hazards, tangling feet and causing men to stumble overboard. Still, the tactic was devastatingly effective. A hooked ship couldn't flee, couldn't regroup, couldn't call for help. It just died slowly as Vikings poured aboard. And while hooks trapped ships, the final weapon was barely a weapon at all. Yet it decided who lived and who died. The shield wall collapses. Your spear is broken. Your sword is stuck in someone's ribs. The man in front of you is wearing mail, and your knife won't punch through. What do you grab? An awl, a metal-tipped ice pick, a leather working tool. Anything with a narrow, hardened point. Vikings didn't always fight with prestige weapons. When battles devolved into grappling chaos, and they often did, warriors used whatever could pierce armor. Awls designed for punching holes in leather had needle-thin points that could slip between mail rings where blades couldn't. Ice tools, used for gripping frozen rigging or chopping through deck ice, had picks that could punch through helmets or skull bones. Even simple metal stakes, carried for tent pitching, became lethal in desperate hands. Archaeological evidence for these tools is everywhere, but rarely recognized as weapons because they weren't made to be weapons. A blacksmith's punch found in a grave beside a warrior's body, a leatherworker's awl with a blood groove worn into the handle. These weren't accidents. They were kept close because when steel met steel and everything else failed, a 6-inch spike could save your life. The tactic was brutal. Grab your opponent, hold him close, and stab upward under the ribs or into the armpit where mail doesn't cover. Or go for the eyes through a helmet's face guard, or the neck where armor gaps. These weren't heroic kills. Sagas don't sing about them, but excavated skeletons tell the truth. Narrow puncture wounds in unexpected places, victims who died not from swords or axes, but from something small, sharp, and merciless. The weakness? These tools had no reach. You had to be close enough to smell your enemy's breath. And if he was stronger, faster, or better armored, your desperate stab might be the last thing you ever did. But these forgotten weapons, they were just the beginning. Because while awls and hooks did the dirty work in desperate moments, Vikings had an entire arsenal of legendary weapons, the ones that actually won battles and carved their names into history. The Dane axe that could cleave through shields in one swing. Ulfbert's swords so advanced they shouldn't have existed for another 800 years. Spears that outnumbered every other weapon combined. These weren't just tools, they were the reason Europe learned to fear the North, and we've broken down every single one. Click here to see the 10 brutal weapons every Viking warrior actually carried into battle. Because if you thought these were deadly, wait until you see what they used when they meant business.